motivated answer to this issue that philosophers have been debating for at least 75 years, namely the best definition of morality. Unfortunately, it may not be true. So let me tell you a little bit about that. Bob said that I'm a notorious skeptic, and I guess I'm living up to his advertising. So many studies have found that in many societies, including our own, transgressions that do not involve harm or justice or rights, so this has to be the conventional ones, right, don't invoke the conventional response pattern. Rather, some such transgressions evoke one or more of the signature moral response pattern elements. Clearly the most, I said perhaps, clearly the most famous hands-down example of this is some work that John Haidt did in the early 90s, using, as John is inclined to do, some very colorful examples, like eating the family dog has been hit by a car in front of the, it's roadkill. Why throw it away? Why not have dog burgers? Cleaning the toilet bowl with the national flag. You got an old flag worn out in the closet. Clean the toilet bowl, okay. And the one that everybody talks about, so a guy goes to the supermarket and buys a chicken in the supermarket and takes it home to cook it for dinner, but before he cooks it for dinner, he has sex with the chicken carcass. The cartoon appeared in Slate magazine when they did a profile on this. Right, well, what John found was that low socioeconomic status participants in Brazil and in the United States all judged these non-harm transgressions to be authority independent and generally applicable. But notice this is a problem because these are central components of the signature moral response pattern. You shouldn't be, ain't hurting nobody, ain't hurting the chicken, ain't hurting the dog, ain't hurting the flag. Okay, so it looks like we got a problem with that part of the Turiel hypothesis. More recently, a group of folks based at Rutgers, including Dan Kelly and myself, have shown that at least in some cases, transgressions, so looking at the other half, transgressions that do involve harm, don't evoke the full moral transgression profile. And I think that our findings pose a serious challenge to the second half of the Turiel hypothesis, which, remember, maintains that transgressions involving harm always invoke the signature moral profile. So our green arrow is at least putting pressure on the second part of the Turiel hypothesis. Well, look, this clearly isn't the place to debate whether Turiel and his colleagues have shown that moral rules and moral judgments are a natural kind. It's a long, elaborate, detailed debate, or whether our challenge succeeds in undermining their claim. What is clear, though, is that experimental work on the moral conventional task has become an important component in the philosophical debate about the definition of morality. That debate that Alistair MacIntyre tells us has been the central theme in moral theory for the last quarter century. All right, I now want to focus on moral realism and talk a little bit about moral realism and disagreement. So Bob said that I was one of the founders of experimental philosophy. Arguably, the first experimental philosopher was Richard Brandt, who spent the last 20 or 30 years of his career at the University of Michigan. And I want to tell you a little bit about one of Brandt's famous studies. He was a moral theorist. He was interested in moral disagreement. And he knew, as many others do, that there's this long literature in anthropology going back to Westermarck in the early years of the 20th century, documenting that moral views or moral outlooks differ quite dramatically in different cultures. But as Brandt realized, this doesn't address what the philosophers want to know, because what the philosophers want to know is not merely do people disagree, but would they continue to disagree if, remember, you get rid of the factual disagreement in the hypothetical or idealized circumstances where relevant factual disagreement has been eliminated? Well, since he couldn't find anything in the literature to address that question, he decided to address it himself. He started a research project in the early 1950s amongst the Hopi Indians in the American Southwest, trying to do philosophically informed ethnography. What Brandt found was that there are a number of quite impressive examples of moral disagreements between Hopis and white Americans of the time, which he couldn't trace to non-moral disagreement. A bunch of examples, the most famous of which that everybody talks about is Brandt found that the Hopis of the time, the children in the communities, would catch small animals, typically birds, but sometimes squirrels and other stuff, and sort of tie them up and put the string to a stake and play with them. Well, the play was typically very rough. The birds ended up with broken legs. They rarely lasted more than a day or 2 or 3, and it didn't look to Brandt like a really nice way to end your life if you're a bird or a squirrel. So he asked the local elders, do they know whether this is... Well, of course they know what's happening. It's happening right... The kids don't hide. They do it right out in front, okay? And is there anything wrong with this? Well, the locals say no, okay? So Brandt then looked for some suggestion that maybe this disagreement depends on a factual disagreement, okay? But he couldn't find anything. Let me give you just a little bit of the flavor of the things he looked at. One obvious hypothesis, only if you're a philosopher, of course, is that maybe the Hopis are Cartesians. Descartes apparently thought that animals don't feel pain. Well, if you don't think animals feel pain, then it's like, I don't know, breaking an old typewriter. It may be sort of silly, but it is not morally bad. So, do animals feel pain? The Hopis apparently think, yes, animals do feel pain, maybe even a bit more intensely than humans. So it's not that. Brandt tried a lot of other alternatives. My favorite is, so maybe they suffer, they are rewarded in birdie afterlife or squirrely afterlife for the martyrdom they suffered at the hands of the children. And as Brandt, by the way, gave me my first job in philosophy, so you can all blame him for this talk. But as Brandt used to describe it, the Hopi looked at him with this, are you out of your friggin' gourd look? They clearly didn't believe that, and he couldn't find any other non-moral belief or failure of imagination that would account for the disagreement. So what Brandt concluded is that these disagreements are in fact fundamental. As he said, they reflect a basic difference in attitude which won't disappear even under the idealized conditions imagined by the moral realists like Boyd and Brink and others. One other study, there are lots of studies that point in this direction. One other that I want to talk about very briefly because I think it's just incredibly cool, and we're in fact following up on it in a follow-up study. But 3, 4, 5 years ago, Joe Henrich and a large group of fellow researchers sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation started studying economic games in small-scale societies. I won't give you the details now. We can talk about them during the discussion if you want. But they looked at ultimatum games, dictator games, public goods games. And what they found, one qualm about this work, I'll tell you the conclusions in a minute, but one qualm about it is they only looked at people's behavior in the economic games. They didn't ask normative questions. So it leaves a question mark open on the interpretation. Joe and a group that I participate in are now trying to remedy that by going to other small-scale societies, repeating some of these experiments, and explicitly asking normative questions. But in any event, let me tell you what they found. They found quite considerable diversity, in fact, shocking diversity. I'll tell you about some of it, again, questions if you'd like, from culture to culture in how people behaved in these economic games.